Thank you all for joining us. We are, um, I don't know everyone who's coming on. I'm not seeing all the screen, but I'm Rabbi Lisa Green. I'm here with Rabbi Wendy Geffen and Natan Gorod from the American Jewish Committee. And this conversation came about from a number of things. No surprise, from events in the world and events particularly in Israel, but not exclusive to Israel, as we're looking at events in Israel and anti-Semitism there and beyond. And it also came out from conversations that Rabbi Geffen and I have been having within our NSCI community and frankly within our own homes. We are both the parents of teenagers. I have three, she has one and essentially the other, even though maybe she isn't chronologically. And and here we are, parents who are used to having tough conversations with our kids and don't shy away from issues. And we're wrestling with how to have these conversations. So we thought it was a really important opportunity to bring a conversation to the larger community and to bring in our colleagues and friends at AJC who are working with this on the ground all the time, right? So what we're going to do is, first off, let me just tell everyone that this is being recorded. Our goal is to not only record this conversation, but then to be able to share it within our NSCI community on our Facebook page, which others could see as well, because we know for sure that there are people who are interested in the conversation who can't be here today. And our goal in this conversation is not to tell people what to believe or what to think or what to say. We are very clear on that. Our goal is to approach difficult times and difficult conversations for us as parents and figure out how we can do them better, how we can work within some information and how we can best support our children in what is a very tough time and hold space with multiple truths coexisting and things that for some of our children that's easier to take and for some it's beyond and what they're being besieged with. So I'm going to turn the proverbial floor over to Natan. He is an Alexander Fellow or Associate, excuse me, at the American Jewish Committee, and his work is particularly focused within their young leadership. I may not have gotten the exact title right, which means he's working with teens, he's working with college students, and he's working with young professionals. So he is right in there with the population that we are, many of us, if not most of us, are parenting and is on the ground with social media with our kids. So Natan's going to give us some information and what he's seeing from his chair, and then we're going to turn it open to questions from all of you. I encourage you to use the chat. And if you have thoughts or experiences, or even when we get to questions as well, we can speak them aloud or put them in the chat. But as you have thoughts along the way, please share those. And of course, otherwise I'll invite you to mute until we ask you to unmute for questions. Natan, thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Green and Rabbi Geffen for having us, and thanks to my AJC colleagues for being here too. Like Rabbi Green said, I can't claim to be any sort of parenting expert, but I do know a bit about sort of social media and high schoolers and college students and young people and kind of the trends going on today. So I was just going to talk for a few minutes about how I see kind of how we got to where we are. Also, granted, this is a rapidly changing situation, and even from conversations we had last week planning this call over the weekend, things have changed, and we've seen an unfortunate rise in some anti-Semitic violence in cities across the U.S. that I think has only escalated over the weekend. So I know we'll get to that as well. But as far as kind of how we got to where we did and maybe why things feel the stakes feel raised for teens, for people who are on social media. I think it's important to kind of take a step back and look at the sort of historical context and how we arrived. And also we'll send out some resources afterwards that I think are good to share. But I think it's important to recognize sort of the tensions that got us to where we were in terms of the sort of the violence between Israel and Gaza. Obviously, we could go back to 1947, 1948, or even before that if you want to really get to the starting point. But as far as this context, when having conversations with teens and sort of they're looking for, they're asking questions like, how do we get here? Like, why did this start? I think I would point at last month, sort of during the month of Ramadan. On the one hand, there was this sort of there's the well-known legal real estate dispute over the community of Sheikh Jarrah in East Jerusalem, and that got a lot of attention because there were a few Palestinian families who were potentially facing evictions, and the Israeli families who said that they claimed that they owned the property were trying to evict the Palestinians, and the Palestinians went to the Israeli Supreme Court and were waiting for a ruling saying whether or not they can continue to live there. They hadn't been paying rent, and we're sort of awaiting that decision, which has been postponed. And that got a lot of attention, especially from where I saw it on social media. A lot of sort of the trendy thing to do these days is post these like Instagram infographics, which sort of try to encapsulate, in my opinion, very complex issues into, short little posts, which none of this can really happen on social media, a real conversation about it. And that was kind of one of the tensions, one of the factors that led to the escalation. But another one that doesn't really get as much attention, I think, is there was this, again, social media, a TikTok trend in East Jerusalem and the West Bank to find, for among sort of Arab teens, Arab youth, to essentially find, Orthodox looking or religious looking Jews and just assault them, physically attack them. And that was almost like a popular thing to do because of this TikTok trend. So again, sort of social media spreading some dangerous actions. So we had the TikTok trend. We had the battle over the homes in Sheikh Jarrah. We also had some violence that broke out on the Temple Mount in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's still sort of unclear. Palestinians had been stockpiling stones and bricks to throw, and it's unclear whether that was sort of preemptive or if that was a result of Israeli police violence on Al-Aqsa. Again, and this is where it comes into the situation being nuanced and complex. It's not black and white, but depending on who you ask, they may say, "Oh, it's very clear that the Israeli police started it," or they may say, "Oh, it's very clear that the Palestinians were preparing to throw rocks." I haven't seen like legitimate sort of definitive one side had done this first or the other side had, and so again, when you see people chop it up to say like this isn't a black and white or this isn't a nuanced or complex issue, this is really black and white. This is a matter of like oppressed people and their colonial oppressors. Those are sort of just some of the buzzwords that have been thrown around. That's really not true. Anyone who follows the conflict or has been following Israel-Palestine for the last, 70 years plus knows that it is extremely complex, really fraught with religious tensions and claims to the land that go back thousands of years. And it's not some sort of, colonialist Zionist conspiracy to just drive Palestinians out. So all those issues sort of boiled over when on the day of it was Yom Yerushalayim, Jerusalem Day, a couple of weeks ago, and there was supposed to be a march through the old city, which typically gets a little bit violent and a little bit aggressive on the part of the young Israelis who marched through. That march was canceled at the last minute by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but the damage had sort of already been done. And Hamas in Gaza, who never misses an opportunity to, make the most of a chance to send rockets into Israel or capitalize on any sort of tension, kind of felt this tension simmering and decided it was time to unleash some rocket fire, not just into southern Israel this time, but all over central Israel, especially Tel Aviv. And I don't know the exact numbers. We had a ceasefire on Friday. I don't know the exact numbers, but it was upwards of 2,000-3,000 rockets, maybe 4,000 over the course of the last 10 days. So if it was 4,000 rockets, 10 days, it's 400 rockets a day. And thank God for the Iron Dome. Otherwise, many more Israelis and Palestinians in Israel would have likely been injured, if not killed. And tragically, of course, people in Gaza were killed in airstrikes that Israel carried out as a sort of response to try to quench the violence on Hamas's end. And so then on Friday, there was a ceasefire, and now we're sort of at the point where here in America, we've seen Jews in LA and in New York being attacked just because they're Jewish or they look Jewish, by protesters, but really they're more than protesters. It's sort of been, from what I've seen, violent mobs attacking them just because they're Jewish. And so all of that is things that like American Jews are sort of carrying with us as we head into a new week this week. Um, there's a lot there, and I think the sort of when it comes to conversations with teens about it, that's how it has to start. I know that was kind of like a sort of history lecture overview, but I think it's important to start with the facts, and then also acknowledging like how we got to the point where social media has become a battleground. Um, in my opinion, sort of in my estimation, a lot of this started last summer during the, after the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests. Someone who spends a decent amount of time on Twitter and on Instagram, it became the sort of popular and trendy thing to do to post, whether it was a pro Black Lives Matter or an anti-police, or just like, here's a link to resources, or here's how Jews can support Black lives, things like that. People were constantly posting, seemingly every day, things like that on Instagram. And I think as people who tend to be more liberal, more progressive, it was a great opportunity to feel like they were an activist, to feel like they were being an ally, to stand up for an issue that they believed in. But unfortunately, it's carried over from that, and now we're seeing a lot of people who maybe don't know that much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but they just think this is another social justice cause. They've seen members of Congress literally equate, Black Lives Matter to what's happening in the West Bank, and so they think, oh, it sort of fits neatly into this social justice box of, Israel bad, Palestinians victims, so therefore they're good. So I'm going to post about it, and show everyone that I'm sort of supporting the Palestinian cause. But as we discussed, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And then I think for young Jews, it's hard or young, Zionist progressive Jews, because they want to support their friends. They want to be in other sort of progressive issues, whether it's like, Black Lives Matter or reproductive rights or climate change or gun control, whatever it may be. But then when it comes to Israel and Zionism, they're branded as, Zionist, which is a dirty word in some cases, or they're branded as, if you're Zionist, you actually can't be for like the liberation of Black lives because you support apartheid, you support oppression, all of these sort of buzzwords that we hear. So that is kind of my like 30,000 foot view of how we got to where we did, and how the rhetoric has become really sort of dangerous and really fiery and sort of charged in many cases. And I would also, encourage others to chime in, and especially from a parenting perspective. But from what I would say is kind of how to have this conversation with your teens, with your kids who might be encountering this on social media. And like I said, I can share a bunch of resources that AJC has prepared. I think it's hard, it's easier said than done, obviously, but trying, if they're comfortable with it and wanting to post sort of, here's what's actually happening type things, AJC has prepared lots of resources that look, Instagram aesthetically pleasing, and are basically saying, here's what's actually happening, here's how you can help, here's sort of myths and truths and fact finding and showing things like that. And I think personally, my strategy, which again, easier said than done, is if I had a friend who posted something that was anti-Israel, maybe anti-Semitic, totally full of lies, I don't think exchanging direct messages like DMs back and forth on Instagram is actually the way to accomplish anything. What I would say is, hey, I noticed that you posted this. I think that you may have missed a couple of things, and I'd love to have a conversation about what actually is happening, and how what you posted as a Jew really offended me. It's sort of like, you don't want to brand someone as anti-Semitic, but you could say this sort of upset me. This offended me. I want to just let you know why I've reacted the way I did to what you posted. And trying to have a conversation off of social media is, I think, the best way. a lot of times people are just talking past each other. But if you move it to, a phone call or a coffee or even just like texting regularly rather than over social media, I think it tends to be more productive. Um, and also, if I know it's almost the summer, but if you're in school and teachers or peers in school say something to the students that is potentially anti-Semitic or just totally off base, maybe a lie about what's actually going on, I think it's important for students to speak up and tell administrators, tell other teachers, sort of if they're in Jewish student clubs, tell the other members of the club, tell the like faculty advisors, because one, it's hard to carry all this as an individual, but you want to make other people known. If a student of color dealt with racism at the school, I would hope that they would also sort of report that to a supervisor. And so it should be the same thing if a student is dealing with anti-Semitism or heard an anti-Semitic comment. I think it's important that they sort of report that and don't just let it slide and say, oh, no, it's fine. That wasn't really anti-Semitic. That was just critical of Israel. And again, that's another conversation we can unpack. But there's a line that has been crossed often over the last 2 weeks, in my opinion, when it comes to, okay, we can criticize the Netanyahu government and some of the decisions that they've made, but you can't say, therefore, Israel has no right to exist, and we need to get rid of all the Jews, and Palestine needs to be from the river to the sea, and Jews don't have a right to their homeland. All of that is is anti-Semitic and is not really a productive conversation. So that's kind of my quick hitters of what's been going on and maybe how to address it. I would offer, I know Zev is our National Director of Campus Affairs at AJC. I don't want to put him on the spot, but if he has things to add, or Rabbi Geffen, Rabbi Green about sort of the parenting perspective, we'd love to open up the conversation a little more.
I think from a parenting perspective, it is really challenging, and we need to be able to support our kids to acknowledge that this is really hard. It is difficult. It is not clear, and people who I think part of it, you just talked about Natan about them going to teachers and administrators. It's very hard to say that even for empowered vocal teens to be able to feel like they can go to someone in authority and question that. So, and there's a very fine line. I mean, I speak as a parent of 3 teenagers. Like, they don't want me going over their heads, nor do I want to. And I have 3 kids who won't hesitate to speak out for injustice for others. But it's a wrestling match. So we can, maybe turning to you all, or maybe others turning to us. I don't know. Maybe just our own kids won't listen to us, but others might. We have some parents here. Anyone have questions that you want to ask? Natan?
Or Zev, I don't know if you want to offer anything also just from your
Please
work.
do.
Yeah, for sure. I think, to build on what Natan was talking about, I think that we're in a position here where we have the opportunity to really turn the last couple of weeks into an educational opportunity for our kids. This is not a moment where we need to be recycling the same couple of, Israel is always in the right, Israel is very just, Israel is very moral. Of course, these things are true, but there's also a reality that students are facing on social media, to the extent that students are in person this year, on campus, in their friend groups, where there are real challenges to be grappling with. More than a dozen Palestinian children were killed in airstrikes, right? This is something that is not just, it's not an uncomfortable, piece of this that we should avoid talking about. This is part of this most recent clashes, and it's something that is being weaponized by anti-Israel activists as proof of ethnic cleansing or of apartheid or of settler colonial occupation. And these are all things that certainly need to be unpacked. And the challenge that we face here and often when talking about Israel on social media is that the anti-Israel movement can shrink down really complex issues into something that is hashtag length or something that fits on a bumper sticker: Free Palestine, settler colonial, ethnic cleansing. And it takes an op-ed and a half for us to be able to explain, no, this is really what's going on, or here are the nuances, or here's what you're ignoring. There's a very now infamous Trevor Noah monologue from a couple weeks ago where I've been encouraging our high school students at AJC to sit down and watch the Trevor Noah monologue, not because the takeaway should be one-to-one with what Trevor Noah is arguing about, a power imbalance and blaming Israel for the bulk, if not all, of the recent conflict. But this is a very well-educated person who is making the same oversimplified arguments that folks are going to see on college campuses. This is what it sounds like to be involved in conversations with folks who are not going to give any Israeli perspectives or Israeli narratives the time of day. So I've been encouraging students to watch it and then read an op-ed that our CEO, David Harris, wrote directly responding to a lot of the points in Trevor Noah's monologue to kind of get a sense of here's what the other side is going to say when they oversimplify this conflict, and here's the language that you can use to talk about it. As Natan alluded to with DMs and with directly confronting folks who are dedicating their social media space or in extreme cases 4 years of college to making the case against Israel or demonizing Israel, especially in college campuses, we also need to set realistic expectations for our children in engaging in this. Somebody who is a leader in an anti-Israel movement, who has been posting things about ethnic cleansing nonstop for the last 3 weeks, is not somebody whose mind we're going to change. And we need to prepare students to not go into conversations with individuals like that, anticipating, all right, if I have my 25 fast facts about Israel and I've got all these resources, I'm going to convince them. That's not going to happen. And we're setting our students up for failure if that's the task we're giving them. If the task we're giving them is twofold: one, identify the folks in your high school, on your college campus, who are receptive to hearing other perspectives. Even if they're not going to change their minds, at least are going to sit down and have a conversation and grab coffee. And we can talk about what's been going on the last couple of weeks. Pursue those conversations because those are moments where folks are willing to be heard. And in the moments where we're talking with these more extreme voices who are not receptive to having their minds changed at all, and in a lot of cases are not even receptive to sitting down with somebody who is identifying as Jewish or pro-Israel or Zionist. In those cases, the best we can hope for is a demonstration of humanity, of saying, I am your peer, I am somebody on your campus, I'm a real person, I'm a good person, and I would just love to be able to be civil here. I'd love to be able to exist in the same space as you. And sometimes that's a reach, but that's a more attainable goal than, hey, person who's been advocating against Israel for 4 years, I'm going to change your mind. That doesn't happen. And within those conversations, especially the ones where there is an opportunity for an audience with somebody who's not 100% on board with our issues already, we're telling our students to be to make this a personal conversation. What's your own connection to Israel? Do you have family there? Do you have friends who were running to bomb shelters? What is the personal experience that you have with this conflict? Because we can, as Natan alluded to, we can go back and back and back, and we can talk about Sheikh Jarrah and the courts, and we can talk about 1967, or we can talk about 1948, and that's very, very highbrow and not necessarily going to translate as well as my name is Zev. I went to UCLA for graduate school, and I have a friend who's serving in the IDF, and she's been telling me about all of the times that she's had to run to bomb shelters the last couple of weeks, and how she had to have an underground Shabbat dinner because she was concerned about, in her apartment because of all of the rocket fire. I mean, that I think is a much more compelling way to engage with peers than attempting to become PhDs on geopolitical issues. The other thing I'm going to say, and I'm not being paid to make this plug, but there's a book that I can drop a link to in the chat if it's helpful. It's called Side by Side: Parallel Histories of Israel-Palestine. I'm in the process of rereading it now. I spent most of Shabbat reading it. It's a phenomenal book because what it does is it takes the right side of the page is the Palestinian narrative on some milestone in Israeli history or some event, and the left side of the page is the Israeli narrative. And they put both of those narratives on each page, so you can't read one section. You can't read about the Balfour Declaration without reading both the Palestinian and Israeli narratives on it. So I think that resources like that, sorry, my 15-month-old gets very, very emotional about these things. But we need to be providing, but most of all, I would say I'll be right there, buddy. We need to be providing our students with opportunities to hear the whole story, because we can't expect for our students to be heard at all if we're not demonstrating that we're willing to hear the whole story as well. So let's not shy away from having our students see things like Trevor Noah, like John Oliver. I learned over this weekend that there are people named Bella and Gigi Hadid who apparently have Instagram accounts and have been saying not great things about Israel. We can't shield, and we shouldn't shield our students from that kind of content. We should use those as learning opportunities, and also opportunities to practice understanding of other people have narratives on this too. And that's going to set us up for the most success in the conversations where there is an opening for us to share.
Thanks so much, Zev.
Can I just jump in real quick, Rabbi Green? And again, to those who are here from NSCI, if you have questions, pop them in the chat or just unmute and come in. We do want to spend some time for that. I just sort of wanted to name a couple kind of specific things that I know are questions that I've thought about in my own navigation of this with my children. And I'll use them as examples. They gave me permission for this, but I have one child who is 14 years old and very, very invested in Israel as part of his Jewish identity explicitly. He is interested in the geopolitical navigation. He is a consumer of all things news, history, strategy. And so he is very, very wrapped up in this and interested in advocating for his position, as that he would perceive of himself as, I think he would likely say he's a liberal Zionist. So sort of, but he opts in. And then I have a daughter who is 12, who honestly could care less, but has been confronted incessantly, truly, for the last 2 weeks, in particular on TikTok. And so much so that she began to really internalize much of the blatant anti-Semitic content, forget critical of Israel content. It was just, and not even anti-Israel content, just blatant anti-Semitic content, specifically because it never said Israel, it just said Jews. And she said to me, I don't want to have a bat mitzvah. Jews are murderers. Jews are killing everyone. And I don't want anything to do with that. Not that she believes Jews are murderers, but this is what was being thrust at her. She's not interested to begin with in any of this. And her feeling was just, why do I want to even be a part of this thing that brings so much accusation, pain, negativity, right? So, and probably both of them, I think, are somewhat extreme, but maybe reveal the span of truth for our teens in particular, and honestly, maybe even adults too, in terms of how we all engage with this. And I kind of just want to name that to say that there's not one unified response, but also to sort of make explicit that whether a person cares about Israel or not, if they're a Jew, this situation now impacts them. Period, because of the sort of slippery blur that's, maybe it isn't even so slippery, the transformation of this narrative from one where one could justify potentially being critical of the Israeli government to one that now represents all Jews. You can look at what's been forget social media. When Jews are called out of a sushi restaurant in LA and beaten up, when Jews are sought out and attacked simply because they're Jewish in America for the so-called Israeli crimes against Palestinians, whatever one views of that, this isn't a critique of Israel. This is blatant anti-Semitism. And honestly, it's how pogroms start. So, we need to think about the fact that whatever divergence of views there are when it comes to Jews on Israel, at a certain point, this does affect anyone who calls themselves a Jew. And thus, I think the importance for the conversation, and in particular, the importance for parents to really think about this in terms of how they're going to communicate with their children, because this impacts not just a political narrative, but actually a Jewish identity narrative. And that is the hold of parents for children. We as your synagogue, we will support you. We will help you. We will give you resources, but we cannot parent your children. Only you can. And we know that given this is an incredible burden to bear for them, for us, but we want to do it together. So I just wanted to share one quick thing that I use personally, have for many years, and really have in the past 2 weeks. It's simple, and it's a great way of helping to remind ourselves and our children about how do you know whether something is critical of Israel or anti-Israel versus anti-Semitic. And it goes back to something that Natan Sharansky created in 2004, I believe, so it's old. He called it then responding to the new anti-Semitism, which is no longer new. It's now a staple form of anti-Semitism, specifically the line about anti-Zionism and anti-Israel viewpoints. And he called it the 3D test. And I wanna quickly show you the 3Ds or tell you about them because they're easy to remember. We'll share the resource with you. For people who follow me on Facebook, it's on my Facebook page. And I found it really helpful, and teenagers and pre-teenagers can understand this too. So the question is, if you don't know whether something is anti-Israel, critical of Israel versus anti-Semitic, there are 3 Ds that can determine it. The first one is demonization, and I'll just read you Sharansky's words. When Israel and its leaders are made to seem completely evil, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when Israel and Israelis are equated with Nazi Germany and Nazis, by the way, a popular hashtag right now, Hitler was right, should tell anybody and everybody that we're in the realm of anti-Semitism. When Israel is seen as the sole cause of the situation in the Middle East, this is considered anti-Semitism, not legitimate critique of Israel. Okay, so D, demonization. Second D, double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively and in grossly unfair manner, and Israel is singled out when clearly immoral behavior of other nation states is ignored, this is anti-Semitism. Okay, so second D, double standards. Third D, delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied alone among all peoples of the world, this too is anti-Semitism. Third D, delegitimization, okay? If it ticks 1D, it's anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean you or your children need to go out and march against it. I would say before we check anything, the first check is, do you or your children feel safe? If you do not, that's where we don't go any further. You call me, you call Rabbi Green, you call Rabbi Daniels. That's exactly why we're here, is to help figure out how to make things work for your specific situation in your family. It's one of the reasons why a synagogue is here, right? But if a person feels comfortable, then the question is, okay, so how should I respond? And I think Natan and Zev have given us really important reminders that battling on social media, first of all, it's ineffective. Second of all, it actually negates and denies the humanity that we all, I believe, understand is so critical about bringing back to the conversation. And we can help empower you around how to have those conversations. So just wanted to kind of bring that information out there. I know there are a few comments in the chat. So I just want to, so I'm just going to read them out loud and then we can talk about them together. Who besides the USA is supporting Israel? We see nothing on social media from a supportive perspective. I'll just answer this really quickly, but then I'll turn it over certainly to anyone who wants to contribute. Actually, there were any number of countries that gave their outright support to Israel very quickly, which was wonderful. So from the geopolitical kind of international relations realm, this was not such a problem. Was that publicized in the media, in particular social media? you know, I guess it's going to depend on what you're looking at and what your filter bubble is on social media. But if you are in a more sort of center left, liberal, progressive sort of feed, then that was my experience, at least, was that was not actively promoted or publicized. In particular, outside of organizations where they would have a vested interest in naming this, socializing that idea. I don't know if Natan or Zev or anyone else, Rabbi Green.
No, and I would just point to a message that Sarah just put in the chat with a link to a tweet. And if you can't read it, I can post all the countries directly in the chat. But it's from May 20th, so it's before the weekend, a few days ago, thanking all of the countries that have spoken out in support of Israel over the last 2-3 weeks. Whether it was their head of state or a foreign minister or some sort of ambassador posting a message of support for Israel, and that list is compiled. And I also wanted to add to something that Rabbi Geffen mentioned with the 3Ds, and she said that Natan Sharansky put it together in 2004, 2006. So sort of perhaps slightly more updated framework that is very, and not that's still very much valid and is applicable in every situation, but there's also a few years ago, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA, came out with a working definition of anti-Semitism, and it's essentially a way to identify and understand if you've seen something that has, and you're unsure if it's crossed a line, sort of lays out what should be considered anti-Semitic versus what is not quite reaches that threshold. And it's been universally adopted and agreed upon by several countries. I want to say a couple dozen countries, including the US, as well as places like the UN and other international agencies and NGOs. Plus now, just within the US, there have been lots of organizations, several universities are also adopting it, not as a means of sort of punishment or holding people accountable, but as an educational tool to say to students, for example, on a university, we have adopted the IHRA working definition, and here's kind of what is acceptable forms of free speech, and here's what's anti-Semitic. Again, not as a way, as some have sort of spun it, not as a way for the university to crack down on free speech. It's not the intention at all, but rather an educational tool, again, to show, hey, Jewish students should be afforded the rights of not subject to hate speech as well. So that's what the IRA tool is for.
Thanks.
There's another, sorry, Rabbi Green. There's another question that was private message to me, but I just it's okay that I share it. So it's a question that I think applies, which is, how can we talk to our kids about anti-Semitism specifically because other people like us seem to not be tolerant of any form of discrimination, yet anti-Semitic behavior seems to be seen as okay by many whom we might see as allies or like-minded in other situations. Right. So I sort of want to name one other thing even before jumping into that, which I think is appropriate, is that anti-Semitism exists pervasively. It always has. It is not the reserve of a single political viewpoint, a single type of person, a single geographic location. Right. And think of our kids for a second, just over the recent few years, was it when was Pittsburgh? 2018, 2018. I lost all sense of time because of this pandemic. So I have no, the timeline of existence is lost to me. But so, right, our kids, our world, but our children in particular, regardless of what they encounter in their local neighborhood, right? And in our community up here on the North Shore, we live in a somewhat, until recently, somewhat idyllic bubble. But regardless of that, our children were confronted by a horrific act of anti-Semitic terror with Pittsburgh. at the hands of someone who we would identify on the, let's call it the extreme right or something like that. And now our children are confronted by horrific anti-Semitism happening at the hands of, I don't know, these are labels that I don't like to use labels. Labels are for shirts, but in some respect, there's no other good way of having a conversation without being able to categorize. So like, let's call this the extreme left, I guess. And I don't mean that in any critical way of one side or another. There are plenty of peace-loving people who abide on those sides. But these are examples of breach, right? Or I often use the example that, a few years ago, David Duke tweeted out something about the Zionist conspiracy, and it was retweeted by Ilhan Omar. And I was like, oh boy, like they love each other. They agree because their common bond is hatred of the Jew. And this isn't new, and we shouldn't forget it. And that doesn't mean we should live in a fear mentality. But I think it's important for all of us to remember that this is not isolated. This is part of a much larger narrative that does not discriminate from one side to the other. For those of us who find ourselves in the liberal community, we probably would have liked to think that since liberals care about protecting other people, of course they'll protect us. And I think we're seeing that that isn't always the case, right? So just want to name that. And I want to name that in particular for this community up here and for our children. There is not a singular, oh, I'm sorry. You go ahead, Rabbi Green.
No, I didn't mean to cut you off. I also want to echo that what our children are learning in school is phenomenal, right? I mean, and like, I'm listening to my kids get all sorts of great critical thinking skills and looking at voices for justice, but anti-Semitism is not on that agenda. I mean, and even though we are in a state in Illinois that's a mandated Holocaust curriculum that is so watered down, and it gets expanded to lots of different senses of genocide, which is all important, don't get me wrong, but that notion of mandated Holocaust curriculum, like, it doesn't really give them the voice. It just equates it all around, and anti-Semitism doesn't get lifted up. So when Black Lives Matter does get lifted up, as it should, I'm listening to, like, even in advanced level classes in high school and in middle school, the kids aren't hearing it, and so they really wonder where their support is and where their teachers are, and so it's a challenging thing. So not only is anti-Semitism seemingly not evident, but it's also not necessarily taught, and so our kids get a message that's not potentially valued. So again, we're not that we should be the persecuted or whatever, but we need to think about it that way too in terms of the messaging.
Yeah, exactly. So I just wanted to sort of then bring it into the concrete. So how do we talk to our kids about anti-Semitism? So the first thing, which probably seems obvious, but I don't think I think a lot of us spoke to our kids about anti-Semitism after Pittsburgh. My guess is that was a somewhat easier conversation to have because it was connected to white supremacy. It was connected to Charlottesville. Like, we had a narrative that I think for many of us, we were probably more comfortable in. And I don't know how many of us have talked about anti-Semitism since. And for those of us with littler children on the early teen side, we might not have even spoken to them after Pittsburgh. So the first thing is we have to talk to our children about anti-Semitism. Full stop. They need to know it's a thing. Because if you live in the bubble of the North Shore, if your kids aren't on social media, they might not know it's a thing. If they're not looking at the news, they might not know it's a thing. And it's a thing. So we have to name it. Our kids have to be able to talk about it with us, their parents. We as their parents can choose how we want to frame that navigation. Again, I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all conversation. We just say, again, AJC, ADL, any of your clergy here are happy to have that particular conversation with you. If you're like, I don't even have a vocabulary to begin. Okay, so, but I think first is to talk about it, that it exists, that it is a legitimate, I can't believe I'm saying this, a legitimate form of hatred that is still pervasive in our lives, not just overseas, not just in Europe, not just in regards to Israel, but right here. And by here, I mean literally right here. Many of you know about the sort of stuff that's gone down on the Facebook groups, local, the mom Facebook groups, local to specifically this community, right? So we need to talk to them about it. Second, we need to listen to them. because every child, every person is going to have their own reaction to that, their own reflection. Some may respond out of kind of like an academic, rational argument. Some may have feelings. Likely it's a little bit of both. We need to hear and we need to respond to our children as their parents, just like we do on any other issue, which is deep and that matters. And seek out resources to help empower ourselves in the conversation. I know Rabbi Green has one more thing, but I think it's really important to discern where fear sits for yourself and where fear sits for your child or children, because the way one then navigates that conversation is different. It's just very, very different. And again, because everyone, I'm looking at the list of who's here from the congregation and who's going to be, listening to this afterwards. That's where I say, please then seek us out as resources, because we can cultivate that conversation with you. Go ahead, Rabbi Green, sorry.
Just exactly where you are, Rabbi Geffen, but I just want to remind us, like, we all know that there are certain things that that push our buttons as parents, right? I mean, I have said over the years, like God and death and sex, or whatever the topics are, the sort of more traditional topics. This could well be one. I will tell you as a parent that for all that I know, I feel like I get a huge knot in my stomach. I've had fascinating conversations with my kid's dad and my kids last week. Like, we sat on my front porch and talked about it, and I named like what I know and what I'm able to figure out the best way to talk about is really challenging. But that we need to, right, to your point, name our buttons, and depending how old our kids are, to actually name that to them and say, I'm going to figure this out with you, for example, or on a wrestle. And sometimes they want information, and sometimes we need to affirm that this is uncomfortable and that they're fearful, and maybe they don't want info right now. But teens, we know, need to be heard often more than anything else. So to name that, we hear them.
Most important is, I think, sorry, Natan, and then I'll be quiet. Most important is, I think, not shying away from the conversation, no matter what insecurity or concern we carry inside of ourselves. If we shy away from this conversation as our children's parents, they will learn and form identity around this from the other sources which dominate their lives. So like, if you're my daughter, that means you're going to get your identity from TikTok. God help her. And if you're my son, you're going to get your identity from the 7 newspapers he reads every morning, right? And I don't want either of those sources to inculcate identity to my children. I won't release the claim. And we don't want you as parents to do that either. That's critically important. Sorry, go ahead, Natan.
No, please. Thank you for that. And I would just add quickly that, Rabbi Green was talking about if your child does want sort of information, and if they're, I'll say like me, and sort of like a facts and history nerd and looking for those kind of things. AJC has, as we posted, several great resources, including from about 6+ months ago, late 2020, a survey of surveying American Jewish feeling about sort of the anti-Semitism and the American Jewish community's perspectives on anti-Semitism, and how things have, to be honest, escalated in terms of a level of anti-Semitism. And there's some great facts in there about, if they were told, to Rabbi Geffen's point, if someone from a Jewish organization said, actually, yes, this is anti-Semitic, then I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it was pretty low as to who would say, oh, because a Jewish organization labels something as anti-Semitic, I agree with it. You would think that should be sort of the experts on the topic would be the ones who, okay, they're credentialed, they're saying this is anti-Semitic, I should agree with them, but unfortunately it was rather low. So I would encourage everyone to seek out that AJC 2020. It's called the AJC 2020 report on anti-Semitism in America, and it really has some valuable information in there, as well as, like, a couple weeks ago, the not AJC related, but the Pew report, I think also does a great job with numbers. And then lastly, just in terms of having this conversation and talking about everything that we are talking about, and naming these things and having these difficult conversations, a great sort of vehicle to do that is the AJC Leaders for Tomorrow program, which is something that we run here in Chicago, as well as nationally. and it's a leadership and advocacy program for high schoolers, designed for high school students, where we meet once a month to sort of unpack these exact conversations. But because it's a recurring program, we meet 7 times over the course of the school year, each time for about 2.5 hours. We really have the space to grapple with these topics and explore, and we go through different themes. Each session, talks about a different subject matter for the day. So sometimes we talk about Israeli history, sometimes we talk about history of Zionism, sometimes we bring in Israeli diplomat who talks about like modern day Israel and the food and the culture and things like that. To be a proud Jew on a college campus and get involved in the community. So I would I'm gonna make the plug for the AJC Leaders for Tomorrow program, which is a really excellent way to also then sort of segue for the kids when they come home from their meeting. It's a great way for the parents to say, "Oh, what did you talk about in LFT today?" And then that's a sort of natural way to begin and spark a conversation, because the students will be coming home from a conversation about Israel and about anti-Semitism. So it'll be on their minds, and it's a great way then for the parents to jump in and kind of bring the conversation home.
Thank you so much. Yeah, a second for that. And just also for our NSCI parents who have high schoolers, we just want to let you know that our high school class next year is a monthly class. It's focused on Israel and these sorts of conversations. It's taught by Rabbi Green, Rabbi Daniels, and our youth engagement professional, Maddie Frischer. It's open to any kid who's a high schooler at North Shore Congregation Israel. It doesn't matter whether they've ever participated in our formal Jewish education program before. They don't have to be a youth group kid or anything else. It's just a monthly opportunity to be with our rabbis and our youth advisor in community for support, for knowledge, for information, for empowerment. And most importantly, that's set in a Jewish context. I always say to people, want to know the best way to fight any form of anti-Semitism? Be a good, strong, empowered Jew in whatever way you define that, right? Because that way anti-Semitism can't win. It doesn't matter what direction it's coming from. But if we walk away from it, right, like that's the risk. At the end of the day, it's not about confronting anti-Semitism, protesting anti-Semitism, which I think we should do if we feel capable, but much more importantly, it's about affirming and claiming our Judaism. That's how we make sure Judaism exists and is alive, isn't some vestige of history or just about these difficult conversations, that it's about something empowering, enlivening, inspiring. And it's how we gain strength. Yeah, go ahead.
Just quickly, I got a question in the chat here that I want to just respond to. So someone asked the difference between now and 2000 or 2005 or 2014, other sort of Israeli, violence with Gaza, aside from social media, what's the biggest difference now? And I can only kind of say my opinion, but I think a couple different factors. One, as opposed to 20 years ago, there's no recent intifada that can sort of have Israel be the clear sort of victim. They're not as much the underdog as they used to be. So for young people who don't remember the second intifada, they've never really lived through a time when to them Israel has not been sort of this more powerful country than it used to be. They don't have the same connection to, the Holocaust or the 6-Day War or the first or second Intifada. So Israel's not really the underdog. And I think another one is, for better or for worse, the sort of the Netanyahu government and the way it's perceived by young, especially those who made their sort of their ethos of the last 4 years was anything that Donald Trump touches, I'm against. And so when they saw Trump and Bibi sort of being friends, and Trump outwardly, hosting him and being friends and doing all these things, saying great things about him, I think for people who are younger and might not know any better, they think, oh, well, Bibi and Trump are friends, therefore Trump is bad, therefore Bibi is also bad. And that's sort of like a very stripped down, simple way to look at it. But I think that's the way that a lot of young people who really have only grown up in their entire lives with Netanyahu as the head of the government of Israel. And that's kind of how they got to a point where it feels different now than maybe it would in 2005, shortly after the second Intifada.
Thank you so much for that. And I know we're just at our time's limit. I would just also add that social media and its influence is completely different and dominant today, even compared to 2014, when of course there was social media, but Instagram was not the go-to for 13-year-olds, 11-year-olds. TikTok was just a make your own music video platform called Musically. There was no like news content, and it has now become something completely different. So I think the way that adults, and in particular children, are now exposed to all of this is amplified beyond anything we could really measure and I think understand, which it should let us know that it's something we have to be talking about. So thank you so much to all of the AJCers who were here. It was great to have all of you, but in particular to Zev and to Natan. Thank you, Rabbi Green, for really shepherding and putting this conversation together so quickly, and allowing our community to be here. And just another reminder to NSCIers, please, if you have questions, if you want to talk more, we will continue to seek out ways to offer programming around this stuff, but you can always reach out to us and to AJC as an incredible local, national, and international resource. So thanks, everyone. We wished you well and look forward to seeing you hopefully more and more in person as these days continue. Thanks.
Thanks so much.